This is Sitrep, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Philippine interests. I'm Ivan at home from Manila. President Marcos Jr. on Friday told world leaders that China's behavior in the South China Sea cannot be ignored as the risk of miscalculation and escalation of tensions continue to increase. In his intervention at the ASEAN conference in Laos, Marcos Jr. gave a detailed rundown on China's ships illegally blasting horns, using water cannons, and ramming Philippine vessels within the Philippines' 200-mile nautical exclusive economic zone. To quote President Marcos, these kinds of behaviors cannot be ignored and demands us to have a concerted and serious efforts to truly manage our disputes in the South China Sea. President Marcos told in a closed-door session to ASEAN leaders in front of the Chinese premier himself to give us her reactions on recent events concerning Philippine foreign policy and the South China Sea. We have with us one of the original architects of the Marcos administration's security policy, Professor Clarita Carlos. Professor Carlos was President Marcos's national security advisor from June 2022 to January 2023. She was the first woman to hold that post since the first Marcos, and the current president's father and namesake was in power. The NSA in the past was typically composed of retired military officials and politicians, making Clarita Carlos a real refreshing tone when she first joined. Professor Carlos is a political scientist and retired University of the Philippines professor with a PhD in political science from the same university. And prior to being appointed by President Marcos, she was also president of the National Defense College of the Philippines from 1998 to 2001. So, Professor Carlos, welcome to Sitrep PH.
Thank you very much.
Professor Carlos, before we begin, we usually ask a lot of our guests to give a brief introduction on themselves and specifically tell us about yourself and how they got devoted into their line of work. So you have had a long and illustrious career in academia and public service. Can you share us perhaps what was the defining moments that shaped your foreign policy, what got you into this line of work to begin with, and what are the things that put you on the path of political science and national security?
Okay, we'll have to make it quick and dirty because we don't have time.
Of course.
My BS actually was foreign service. And since I was too young to take the foreign service exam, I took a master's degree in political science, during which time I was chosen by the chairman to teach. So I started teaching at the age of 20, so I'm now 78, so you can do your arithmetic. And it's been a long journey for me. How did I get to where I am right now? With lots of difficulty, hard work, and perseverance. But I've always been politically and socially conscious, rallying in the streets, in front of the U.S. Embassy, wanting all the military bases to get out for various reasons. And like that, and my social consciousness, my political consciousness was deeply honed and broadened by my continuing teaching, international politics course. And right now I'm teaching a course on geopolitics and regional integration. And so it's really a continuing journey until, I don't know, I'll die in the classroom, I think.
And naturally, you had a very colorful and exciting tenure as the National Security Advisor to President Marcos. What did you think was one of the more pressing security matters that you faced during your tenure? And what were the real challenges that you really got a grip on?
Well, first of all, as you had noted in the intro, my being female and my being civilian became, there was a brouhaha about that, which was really unnecessary because the same thing was raised when I was president of the National Defense College after a long line of retired military officials. And I said, and I was so fortunate that my concept of national security as human security is in synchrony with the United Nations concept of national security. Not that it differed from the military predecessors, but it simply shifted it to a more humane take on what national security looks like. Of course, you're interested in what goes beyond our waters, but I am not interested about that like on a day-to-day basis. I'm just interested to have,
yes,
money, and that when I leave my house standing, I will also come back standing. All those kinds of things, which I thought would resonate with the ordinary Filipino.
And that was one of the noticeable tone shifts of the Marcos foreign policy and security policy under your tenure, which many people noticed and actually got several pushback from certain quarters, because you were very notable in your opposition to red tagging, for example. You were very notable in, as you said, emphasis in human development as a means to ensure national security and to serve as counterinsurgency. Why did you think you got such severe pushback by certain more entrenched elements when you, for example, came up against red tagging?
Well, mainly because I'm a social scientist. Red tagging is, I say, a lazy way of arguing.
Yes.
When you block compelling arguments, you red tag. And what about the reputation you have destroyed, of my colleagues, of my friends? You don't have any basis for such, I mean, those articulations belong to the tabloids, not the major network. So that was the first thing that I really pushed. No red tagging. No, if you cannot defend your predicate, you shut up. This, I teach a course in philosophy of social science, and that's really the fundamental, that's the fundamental dictum. When you cannot defend your statement after I know, then you shut up. It's like, who was it? George W. Bush. He said, I know there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, destroyed the country, killed millions. And then he said, I'm Malaya, I made the mistake. Can you see? I'm exaggerating to make a point.
Absolutely. And that's exactly one of the reasons why we got you here, because you provide such a very unique take, and you were one of the original architects of the Marcos security policy. Now in 2024, as we start to end the year, Professor, how would you assess how things are going right now, especially it's a broad question in terms of national security, and specifically our policy with China at the moment, with things heating up, and with what President Marcos the rhetoric that President Marcos has been saying in ASEAN in front of the Chinese premier. What are your initial reactions?
I guess because I was in cabinet for like 6.5 months.
Yes.
President Marcos is how would I call it? I'm trying to look for a term. It's like a pragmatist. You will recall he moved away from, he just had a state visit with China. And then that was the time, the week after, that I resigned for reasons which I cannot reveal to you.
Of course.
And after that, the U.S. ambassador announced, which he is not supposed to do, the 9 EDCA sites. So all of these are happening all at the same time. And right now we are really seeing the cascading trajectory of our Philippine foreign policy, which really was at cross purposes with many, many of my memos to the president about not continuing to be the tail of the American kite, but to move towards multi-alignment in a multipolar world.
And do you feel currently that the Marcos administration is moving towards a more multipolar world, especially with engagements with the Quad, for example? Or I know in early 2023, you talked about how it would appear that China's aggressive push to the Philippines and their constant harassment seems to have pushed us back to our traditional allies. Does this give you some sense of disappointment, that the fact that it would appear that the Chinese have pushed us back to our traditional foreign policy stance? Or do you not see it as such? Do you see it as a more multipolar approach that the Marcos administration is taking?
It's more than disgust. It is outrage, because I have, especially right now that I'm no longer national security advisor, I have continuing conversations with the Chinese officials. And what really, puzzles me as a political scientist is, how is it that I've spoken to their foreign minister, Wang Yi, when he was here. I continue to speak to Wang Xilian, their ambassador, and we seem to be on the same page on moving from high politics of territory and sovereignty to the low politics talking about fish, the seabed resources, oil, natural gas, etc. How is it that when they open their mouths, it seemed like they forgot what we talked about? I mean, of course, I'm a political scientist and I know what real politics looks like. But yes, whenever their leader, Xi Jinping, talks about shared future, shared resources, shared prosperity, they should put some beef in it. Or is it just what, saliva? This is what I continue to, in fact, I continue to chastise them and tell them to their faces that they push Bongbong into the arms of the Americans. Because that's really what happened.
Did you feel that the President Marcos honestly had no choice when in terms of the EDCA basis? Because as you rightly said, the EDCA basis, what the real discussions and real work on them really opened up after the President Marcos's Beijing trip, and he got no apparent concessions from the Chinese on issues such as sovereignty, such as even what you said, resources. And so do you feel that President Marcos had no real choice other than to resort to the current path on foreign policy?
Actually, to be fair to President Bongbong, you content analyze his declarations regarding China. Very first declaration, he didn't even mention the United States. He said, China is our friend, our partner, our neighbor. If I were the Chinese, I would latch onto that and really make it more robust, grow it into a tree with fruit-bearing trees. But nothing like that happened. The thing is, we were caught in the middle. We're just the pawns between these two fighting giants, between the U.S. and China. And if our strategists do not put that into their thick heads, I don't know where we're going, because we're just simply. Do you remember when, what's his name, Biden met with Kishida in Yun of South Korea? Did they invite Bongbong? I said, hello. I was the only one who posted on Facebook. It's like a satire. I said, oh, somebody was left out and was not invited to Camp David. Of course, he was invited months later, but it was like, by the way. So it seemed like, we're like a mistress. Whenever you want to have sex with me, let's have sex tonight. Then later, I forget who are you.
That's a very frank way of approaching it, Professor. But to go to the analogy, we seem to be a very attractive lady right now in the West Philippine Sea. Many parties want a piece of us. To continue your analogy, which makes the actions of the CCP somehow befuddling, because they came out of the Duterte administration somehow a more with the friendliest Beijing-Manila relations in ages, and yet they did not deliver on the billions of planned infrastructure. Not only that, they continue to cause harm to our civilian vessels, which look bad in the Philippine press. I know you yourself is confused, but perhaps as a political science professor, what do you think is going on in the CCP? Why on one hand they promise us friendship, and on the other hand, they ruin our relationship and continue to pursue a wolf warrior diplomacy?
Well, let's open our eyes to the friendship that they were offering. Let's not quibble about this thing, and let's not be naive about it. The friendship that they offered to Duterte was really a friendship underpinned by Duterte kowtowing to them. You remember the so-called secret agreement regarding a union? You know what was the secret agreement? Of course, it was it's an open, it's already in the press. It's not anything confidential or intel. The secret agreement was, we can resupply our Marines there if we ask their permission first. Hello? If I ask your permission first, that means you own something, isn't it? And we're not stupid people. And I argued that with Wang Silian, with the ambassador. I said, okay, I just discovered that there is a MOA between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard. Let it work. There is already a legal framework. You're talking about common fishing grounds, marine protected areas. Let us work on that. Let us marginalize the territorial and sovereignty issues, because we will all be dead and there will be no resolution to those things. So, do you see? He agrees. He nods his head. He says he's going to report to Beijing and to tell, the views of, I was NSA at the time. And what is so lamentable right now is that I have several invitations to speak to Chinese academics in China, but it seems like because of my situation, it's so untenable to go there now. But I would like us academics to talk about these things. And because I think it is the academics, it is the scientists, the marine scientists, who will resolve this issue. not the politicians and the diplomats. And I continue to believe in that dictum.
And perhaps we can have a follow-up to that. You mentioned the Duterte administration's policy to China, Professor. Perhaps you can explain to our listeners, how did that 6 years of the Duterte foreign policy severely impact our posture, both in the West Philippine Sea and globally, and what was laid in the feet of President Marcos and your team at the start of his term? What was left before you guys? What did you guys have to work with in 2022?
Okay, we had to work with 6 years of Duterte, where, as I said, it was not really a partnership, co-partnership. It was not a partnership of equals. It was a partnership of a dominant actor and a subordinate actor. Everybody knows that. You don't need to be a political scientist to see that, unless you're a stupid person and close your eyes to these things. Marcos has to work on that as a basis, and I know that. And I was trying, really to dig us out of that conundrum and move into a new direction. And I thought that his declaration and a subsequent visit, I thought that would be a new start. And I was wrong. And I was wrong because China's continued bellicose and aggressive actions really, to use your term, forced the hand of Marcos to move away from the Chinese pole and to move towards the American pole. I hope that can change. As a matter of fact, right now that Speaker Martin is my principal, I keep on also sending him memos and also briefing him that we can move sideways. And despite the Mutual Defense Treaty, let us join the BRICS. Let us join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Let us join any and all organizations that will really enhance our economic life. Never mind, don't pay attention to territory and sovereignty. These are, as I say, saliva things, nothing happens there. And whenever there's a statement about this, I just don't pay attention to it. I pay attention to how much virgin coconut oil is being sold, mangoes, durian, etc. These are the things that matter.
So to put a nice bow on things from that line of conversation, you would say, Professor, that Manila was more than friendly to the Chinese going into the negotiations under President Marcos, but it was Beijing who simply did not play their role, who simply did not keep their end of the bargain, to put it simply.
Let us say Beijing did not give us the tools to push the low politics diplomacy.
What tools was Manila expecting in your perception?
We wanted, like for example, there were 100 Chinese militias in the contested area. I said, Ambassador Wang Xilian, you reduce it by 20, give us some goodwill. And on the other hand, then we will also, it's like a quid pro quo. That's what politics is all about. Transactionalist. So for this is what we're going to give. For this is what we're going to give. But nothing like that happened. And so right now you have an increasing escalation of conflict. And I hope it will not, result in, we killing each other or some soldiers being killed and their militias also being killed. We don't want to go there. But little known to many people is that there are continuing functional cooperation happening. The environmental lawyers of China are here in our university, exchanging views with our environmental lawyers, our accountants. Even on the level of the diplomats, there are really back channeling happening, except they are not sexy to report. And what is what will sell the papers is really something like, China increased already the number of militias, Coast Guard, etc. But if you really look deeply into what is happening, I just met Wang Xilian when was that? 2 weeks ago in the Chinese embassy function, and we really had we're laughing all the time and said, hey, what happened to what we talked about, moving from high politics to low politics? Then he said, we're moving. But those things are not being reported. And I'm glad all these things are happening because that means we're not at the cusp of, killing each other.
Professor, it's a good thing that you mentioned, and perhaps we can transition there to we can transition conversation to the future. You talked about digging ourselves out of this and preventing us being on the cups of war. I guess for the average Filipino right now listening, how are we able to dig ourselves out of the current apparent diplomatic quagmire? You may not think so, but that's certainly the perception of many Filipinos. It would seem that we would send a series of note verbals through the DFA to Beijing, and that would go fall on deaf ears, and at the same time they would continue to warn us not to dig for resources such as oil and gas in the West Philippine Sea. They would continue to harass our fisher folk over near Ayungin and in Scarborough Shoal. So I guess, frankly, how do you expect us to further engage with diplomacy with Beijing when you yourself said that they appear to not be they appear to be in the habit of not keeping their end of the bargain? And this isn't so much as a criticism of anybody, but more like a hypothetical. How are we capable of moving beyond the current quagmire?
Okay, the fundamental platform would be move from the high politics of territory and sovereignty and migrate into the low politics of discussion about fish, environmental protection, etc. Right now, my research team is writing 2 books. First book is Regional Fishing Agreement. Let the political actors involved agree on a regional fishing agreement, when to fish, when not to fish, what to fish, etc. And that will be, we will have a binding, framework there. If it's not binding, it's just a piece of paper. Then the other book we're writing is on R2P, Responsibility to Protect. Normally, R2P really is an international law, which extends to genocide, crimes against humanity. But I extended it as the head of the team. I said, let us extend it to protection of the environment. So responsibility to protect the environment. Let's bring in China there. Every opportunity to have exercises and training, it will have to be exercises to mitigate the consequences of climate change. There is no enemy. The enemy is climate change. If we cannot pound that into the heads of our politicians and diplomats, I don't know where we're going. But if climate change is what we need to confront, then believe me, the conversation will differ radically.
Professor Carlos, you mentioned, for example, fishing and having a more unified, codified rules on fishing among the ASEAN states, including China. How would this fly, though, in the face of rhetoric? We recently have several months saying that if certain Filipino fishermen are caught in Chinese quote unquote territory, they would be arrested. They would be detained for several months. They would have major fines applied on them, and the Chinese threatening to actively board civilian Filipino vessels that are engaged in resource collection. So perhaps how would you be able to untangle? It would appear that for Beijing, this is an issue of sovereignty. And so from the perspective of you and from the perspective of Manila, how can we untangle this web between both sovereignty and resources in the West Philippine Sea?
Well, China has to remember that we are their neighbors. They are selling to the world. They're selling to us. In other words, you don't quarrel with the countries to whom you are selling. Also, they are getting something from us. We're the 5th most mineralized country in the world. Okay, how to do it? The quick and dirty answer is incrementally. Let us talk first of, I don't know, maybe let's talk of Galonggong. Then we spill over to other areas. We're talking about a particular fish species. Then let us talk about when to fish, what to fish, when not to fish, etc. China cannot just unilaterally declare a 3-month fishing holiday because it affects our fishermen. It affects our food security. So I have repeatedly used this argument with the Chinese officials with whom I have a conversation. And I like to show them that it is in their interest that we agree on these things, that we cooperate, and we do not go to war. No one wants to go to war. There is already an arms race happening in the region. Yes. The new, the new prime minister of Japan is so leaning towards the U.S. The same with the president of South Korea. We should not be part of that circle. As a matter of fact, if Trump gets elected president, we should ask for the radical review of the Mutual Defense Treaty. We should ask for Article 5 of NATO, immediate retaliation, so we don't quibble about ironclad promises and on all those promises of their state department officials. Let us not do things recklessly and carelessly. There is a Filipino term for that. It's called burara. Burara really goes beyond reckless and careless. So let us demand that if they don't agree, let us abrogate the Mutual Defense Treaty. All right? And we know already that is an unequal treaty in 1951. Abrogated, and let us move sideways and go multilateral. Let us go multi-alignment. Let us go for a multipolar world. Do you see how this can all come together? We're not really, sinking in a quagmire. This is not, what do you call this? It's not a quicksand. We can move sideways. You move sideways. And if you look at the factors going for us as a country, we can be the leader of Southeast Asia.
Yes. And it's a good thing you mentioned our Western alliance, because perhaps that's where we can transition to a conversation on our Western partners and their allies. You mentioned PM, the new Prime Minister of Japan, PM Ishiba, and then naturally President Yoon of Korea, which is another right-winger. Don't you think, Professor, that the current belligerent tone of Beijing is currently leaving it increasingly isolated in the region, as multiple states are starting to align, as you noted, with the West in reaction to belligerent Chinese actions? For example, they absolutely beat up those 10 Chinese Vietnamese fishermen just recently. And so at what point will Beijing realize that their actions is merely driving individuals to traditional Western partners rather than building the multipolar world that you and the Chinese ambassador are dreaming of?
Well, China is a very patient nation. It's not a civilization with 5,000 years behind it.
Right.
And it knows what it's doing. It has a continuous political leadership, not marked by every 4 years or every 6 years changes in leadership. There is no ASEAN collective stance because the countries fed by the Mekong, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, all are hostage to the Mekong River system, which feeds their food security, agriculture, etc. So let us not talk of ASEAN collective stance. There is none.
Of course.
It's just saliva, So China knows its chessboard. And let us hope we're playing in one chessboard and not several chessboards. And China is a strategist. We stupid people should be a little bit smart, intelligent about it. Because we also have so many things going for us. As I said, millions of professionals like you and me, scientists, put them together with all the minerals under our soil, and voila. There's no leader of Southeast Asia right now, isn't it? We should be the leader of Southeast Asia. Let us just be smart about it, And I gave, before I resigned as National Security Advisor in one cabinet meeting, I gave a book to President Marcos, my book on Towards an ASEAN Parliament. And he said, do we need it? I said, yes, Mr. President. The ASEAN is moving from cooperation to regional integration. And I want you to lead that. He said, isn't it difficult? And he said, no, Mr. President, I will help you make it happen. But I resigned.
Professor Carlos, are you honestly saying that you expect within the next few decades ASEAN moving towards an EU model with more political centrality through an ASEAN Parliament, maybe in Singapore or Jakarta? Do you honestly think that we can move forward to this despite our challenges?
That should happen soon, not 10 years. That should happen in my lifetime. I don't like 10 years. I'm 78. No. One thing's to happen within 5 years. No, we're moving towards that direction because already there are commitments for the Troika, the ASEAN Economic Community, ongoing ASEAN Political Security Community, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. If you do not have an ASEAN Parliament, then where is the regional legislation? We really need it. It's not an if, it's a when. But the thing that we need to do is really make a massive, comprehensive campaign to let people know that we need an ASEAN Parliament. And yes, we are not going to follow the mistakes of the EU Parliament.
I was talking to other national security experts and even people from outside, from Singapore, for example, like Professor Colin Ko in Singapore, and he would point out exactly what you said, that there is no united ASEAN uh, collective voice when it comes to matters of national security, of national and regional security, when it comes to matters of even sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. You have President Marcos over there apparently being isolated in his vocal opposition to Chinese aggression, whilst the others have either remained silent or are giving very soft remarks, soft support in favor of sovereignty and whatever. Uh, how do you expect ASEAN to move beyond its regional differences when even something as simple like the ASEAN Code of Conduct for the Sea is very much uh, frankly, for a lot of people view that as empty talk at this point, considering that China is constantly using its Mekong allies to prevent any significant talks on that and on restraint and on sovereignty, for example.
A quick answer is stop using the ASEAN platform. Let
Right.
things occur multilaterally, bilaterally, because you're interested in results, isn't it? Just be interested in the outcomes. We don't care how you do it. There are some countries like Malaysia and Indonesia who have, in fact, already have a modus vivendi with China. They couple the political, the territorial, and the sovereignty issues with the economic. I mean, look at that high-speed train from Jakarta to Bandung. Okay, look at what is happening in Malaysia. Look at what is happening in Laos, linking Laos with mainland China. Let's be smart about this. Look at the aborted railway in Mindanao. All these things. That's what I'm saying. Again, repeatedly, move from high politics to low politics, and you will have results. And that is where we will be on the same page as China. China wants to have some strategic paramount dominance here. We will not give him that dominance, nor the U.S. Let this be a region of, non-contest of the two superpowers, because if they want to quarrel, let them quarrel in their own territory, conduct a war of attrition, but do not involve us. So if there is still more intelligent strategies in our government, I hope they will work towards that trajectory.
You mentioned Chinese hegemony, and this is certainly one of the major anticipations or fears, depending on how you perceived it, Chinese hegemony in the region and their overall goals, whatever that may be. I guess for the Philippines, since you're very much interested in a multipolar world, how are we to balance the different perspectives and the different goals of great power politics as China tries to break out of the first island chain, as America continues to try and maintain its hegemony, and with the Pacific continuing to be its lake? How are we to balance this? And then I've got a follow-up question to after that, Professor.
Okay, when you look at interstate relations, you find that you have an array of factors that bring about either conflict or cooperation or just plateau. And when you look at the factors accounting for cooperation, you find out that there are actors who are important and there are lesser actors. The important actors are elites. This is backed up by the empirical literature. Elite complementarity, meaning elites perceiving similar benefits, similar risks, similar impacts, similar consequences. They are the ones that will push this towards cooperation. So we're hoping that Xi Jinping, I'm sure he will not live, forever, but the Politburo behind him, we're hoping that eventually, because of continuous interaction with other political leaders, and because no one wants to go to war, eventually there will be a meeting point. And I think the meeting point would be one, no one owns the seas. We are one of the 6 stupid people who are, carving out the seas into 6. There is only one ecology. There is only one ocean. That's the reason why I said, let the marine scientists, let us, the political scientists, the social scientists, take the lead in resolving the South China Sea issue. And there are already inroads. They are not reported, but they are happening. I know because I'm participant in many of them. So I'm very, very optimistic, guardedly optimistic, really. It may not happen in my lifetime, but the elite complementarity, the elites coming together and perceiving that it is best to cooperate rather than to kill each other, that will happen, and soon.
Soon, hopefully. And one of the things you mentioned earlier is the fact that these moves can only happen through incremental change, and yet we see all around us, yes, incremental change happening, but also big power plays that are being undertaken, especially even here in Manila, through the pen of the president. And so you've got people asking in my chat group about the Typhoon missiles that are being planted in Luzon, to the chagrin of China. You've got EDCA bases being planted, also, with possible more EDCA bases. You've got increased U.S. Uh, Foreign military assistance to the Philippines. And so, what role do these big power plays, these big deterrence factors have in your incremental policy, Professor? How do you react to these major shifts by Manila, such as having medium-range missiles in Luzon for the explicit purpose of territorial integrity, mind you? And so, yes, how do you square the incremental moves in diplomacy versus these big moves in the chessboard?
Yeah, it's like a ladder, Sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down a bit because politics is compromised. It can be done. The so-called missiles in the EDCA bases, they can immediately be withdrawn in the same way that they were suddenly there. And we only need a new policy direction. But as I said, Bongbong is fairly intelligent about this. He's making calculations. He is reacting to anything and everything that is happening on a daily basis. But for most parts, I think we're still in the same strategic level, but the operational and the tactical components are certainly different. I'm no longer part of the intel loop, but I can see that from the articulations of the president that we are not nearing, like we're going to just kill each other. I don't think that will happen. And so there are many, many ways of mitigating this, but we need cooperation from all actors. So also, I think there should be a fairly good determination of who we are as a political actor in the Southeast Asian region. If we continue to swim and to sink in the American narrative, then we're dead. Move away from the American narrative. Let us have our own Filipino narrative.
Who are we as a political entity in ASEAN? To put your question back to you, Professor. Well, what is the Philippines in ASEAN right now and in the region?
To answer that, let's go back to the first Marcos. We were the leader of ASEAN. When Marcos speaks and he does not read from a paper, even Lee Kuan Yew cannot speak anything in edgewise. We were the leader. If Bongbong puts his heart into it, we can still be the leader and set the agenda of ASEAN. Right now, we're at the bottom of every list. That's not something that concerns me. That list can still change, but with a lot of political courage and commitment. As you can see, I'm almost like Pollyanna, but I'm not Pollyanna. I'm guardedly optimistic because I know what we have on the ground. I know millions of professionals like me, millions of scientists who think like me, except that they don't have a chance to be interviewed in your program. But I'm sure if you interview marine scientists, they will articulate basically the same position that I have taken and more.
What is the difference between a Pollyanna-ish approach versus the more pragmatic approach that you're proposing? Because it would appear to many people that Duterte took a very Pollyanna-ish approach, took a very conciliatory approach to the detriment of national security. So how are you going to ensure that the Philippines continue to maintain a deterrence factor, continues to still be taken seriously, but whilst at the same time ensuring I know I've asked this several times already, but where's the balance there specifically, Professor? Because there are, even in our local political climate, there's that push that you hinted on between a more militant and a more hawkish stance versus a completely pacifist stance. Where is the middle ground?
Always extremes are not acceptable.
Yes.
You cannot extremely Pollyannish, happily ever after, tra-la-la. You cannot be Cassandras, always doomsayer. You must really find the mean, and the mean is not a fixed point. This is like a continuum. The mean is making sure that our eyes are still on the ball, And the goal is a high quality of life for everybody. A high quality of life means peaceful. A high quality of life means we can fish where we have to fish, where we have fished for centuries, etc. These are all non-political issues. They are issues of the stomach. They are food security issues. They are energy security issues. Can you see the change in conversation is if we move from the high politics of territory and sovereignty, if we move from the concept of ownership to stewardship, we don't own anything. No one owns this planet. We are just taking care of it for the next generation. If you move from ownership to stewardship, oh, there will be a radical change in mindset. And that is what I'm doing in my classes I teach every time, like here in this interview, my writings, etc. Because it's the only way to go. The alternative is really, you commit collective suicide or you get killed. Is that an alternative? It's not an alternative. It's unacceptable.
Professor, you mentioned a few questions ago, now that we're talking about ranges and means, you talked about the escalation ladder. Honestly, Professor, who is leading us up the escalation ladder at the moment? Because it would appear that to even the most amateur viewer that the tensions have continuously been ratcheting up for the last few years, to the point where our fisher folk are being harassed, to the point where they're not only actively ramming our vessels, but they're actively searching for our vessels to ram. And naturally, there's the laser lights also trying to blind our helmsmen. Who is climbing the escalation ladder? And as a follow-up to that, how can we go down the escalation ladder, especially if certain parties aren't interested in going down?
All the major political actors are involved. China and the United States. The Philippines is just, as I said, hanging on the belt of the United States, the tail of the American kite. And so wherever the U.S. goes, carries the Philippines with it. And of course, South Korea and Japan willingly for both, us reluctantly. And how do we de-escalate this increasing escalation? Where both parties really share the sentiment that they cannot go to war and that war will be a loss. This will be a loss for both, but it should be a non-zero-sum game where somebody wins some and somebody loses some. We cannot have a zero-sum where one political actor wins and the other gets zero. Whenever you play zero-sum, then you know what happens to you. And there are many, many historical data that will support that. Don't ever play zero-sum. You play non-zero-sum. Let the other party win. Like if you want to talk joint exploration with us, extraction of resources, don't give this is going to be what joint looks like. Hello, and we are stupid people. So sometimes, we're really stupid because sometimes we sign at the bottom line, knowing that the agreement really is skewed in favor of the other political actor. Why are we doing that? So let's not do that anymore, okay? Keep on using the term, be smart, intelligent about it. Do your research, find out what is in the Philippine rice, find out what resources are there in the seabed, in the contested areas, and then negotiate. You cannot negotiate lazy, which means you don't have data behind you. Because if you don't have data behind you, and China or the other political actor, US, has the data, you're dead, isn't it?
All right. And I think this is a great time that we can transition to talking about Philippine defense, Professor, since you were a prominent figure at the National Defense College. And my first question would be how you see the armed forces of the Philippines transitioning from its counterinsurgency role now that the NPA has been isolated to several pockets and will likely be crushed in a few years, and the anti-insurgency campaign seems to have been successful. How do you envision the armed forces of the Philippines transitioning to external defense and its role in the ASEAN region? I recall in the SMNI debate, you were very much interested in this, specifically in reorganizing the AFP, transitioning the AFP to being a more external force. You even questioned the role of the Philippine Marines, for example. How do you see the armed forces of the Philippines within the next few decades?
Okay, a little bit of history. Commonwealth Act number 1, 1935, the Philippine Defense Act. So our Armed Forces of the Philippines was configured in 1935 when we were still a colony of the United States. Can you imagine how long ago was that? Do your arithmetic. So one of my continuing campaigns, really missions, if you want to call it that, is to restructure this AFP. You cannot have a huge number of army. We don't need an army. This is not how we win wars. We win wars with drones, with cybersecurity. But you need, because you need to protect our seas, you need a big marine force, a navy, an air force to cover them. You don't need an army. And yet, if you look at the demographics, the profile of the AFP, it has a huge, huge army component. Yes, I hope they will move away from ESO because that is not their mandate. Their mandate is external defense. Talking about external defense, defense is not really beyond our shores. Defense is really defending food security, energy security. If you defend all this militarily, but you don't have food and you don't have energy, where are you? You were dead also in the short run, isn't it? So again, we need to go back to, at the beginning of this interview, move national security away from its military focus. Not that you are going to, don't pay attention to it, but don't make it number one and make it a human security concern.
Just briefly, before we transition to the emerging technologies, which you hinted on, what would you say about rhetoric coming from certain political classes in this country over restoring mandatory ROTC and restoring maybe even conscription to the detriment of about 30 billion pesos? You were the constructor of the Marcos foreign insecurity policy before. How would you react to statements calling for ROTC to be restored as a mandatory component?
First of all, rename it. Don't link it to partial or total mobilization.
Right.
Make this training of the young and don't, force them. Don't do it under duress. You know what will happen? They will move. And make it really a disaster, a climate change underpinned module. We've been doing that really. It's like the Balikatan, and I've been for so many years senior consultant of the Visiting Forces Commission. The Balikatan, supposed to be during the time I was there, is engaged only in HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster response exercises. Unlike before, where you're training together to fight together. But now it went back to training together to fight together. Let's not do that. Let's again go back to HADR. We're all fighting climate change. If something happens in the contested South China Sea, let us say you have a massive oil spillage, it is not only China who will clean up. It will be all the countries washed by these waters, oil-infested water. So I hope this doesn't happen, but I think that's the only time we stupid people will be thinking, oh, yes, we really move from fighting each other to cooperation because we have to clean up, because the fish will be washed with oil and we cannot eat fish with oil, which has spilled in the area. So, look for the common denominator of where people will agree first, and let us hope that it spills over into more sensitive areas after you have planted trust, confidence, goodwill in the low politics area. It's the same framework, isn't it? I just keep on going back to that framework.
And I'm sorry for going back to this, but since you mentioned it, Professor, you talked about how the Balikatan and even the EDGA bases, how the rhetoric coming from the AFP seems to have gone from this is humanitarian, this is cooperation building, to this is a key component in preserving Philippine sovereignty, in preserving Philippine territorial integrity. How do you feel about, honestly, about how that rhetoric seems to have changed? The fact that we are now openly saying that the Typhoon missiles in Luzon are there as a key component to preserve Philippine sovereignty. And do you see what concessions can Beijing give in order for us to perhaps start removing several of those missiles, for us to make perhaps limiting U.S. hardware in the EDGA bases?
Actually, the hardware part is the easier part. The more difficult part is changing the mindset and changing the goal of these two superpowers. If they only shift their minds to climate change, then as I said, there will be a radical mindset change. And all these things, they're only on the tactical and operational level. That's easy to change, but let's not be preoccupied with that. And I think we are moving towards that direction. Xi Jinping is, I think he's moving towards my age cohort, towards his 70s. And I'm sure he wants to leave a legacy of cooperation and not war. And China, despite its claims that it's not expanding, maybe it's seen as expanded, but maybe for good reason, expand the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the like. If only we can make our arithmetic in regard to what happens if we cooperate, rather than if we go to war. What happens if the money we put in the arms build-up, we put in, dealing with our still high double-digit poverty level, then some things will change. How? Again, the elites thinking will have to change. How? Again, you have to elect people whose thinking would be the thinking of a scientist. Do you remember Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany? She was there for 16 years. She is a physicist, and the way she conducted herself, there will be no Ukraine if Angela Merkel were there, because Angela Merkel is trained as a scientist, and she does not do anything unless there's empirical evidence behind her decision. That is, I'm sorry to keep on batting for scientists and the like, but I don't know. Do we deal with policy and base it on chismes or gossip? We don't do that. You have to ask us scientists, because all our lives we have devoted to worshiping in the altar of science. It sounds so up there, but yes, that's the reality. What can I say?
No, I completely understand. I mean, one of my political heroes is Margaret Thatcher, and she wrote and spoke fondly about how her chemist background allowed her to actively view things from a very objective perspective. So we understand where you're coming from, Professor. Going into science and technology, you have in your work spoken extensively about emerging AI and about both the risks and benefits this poses, especially in the field of national security. Earlier this year, you've got reports coming in from the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Network, and also I think last month, a report from the College of William and Mary in the United States through A-Data, talking about how state-sponsored actors are attempting to use AI, troll farms and the like, in order to engage in PSYOP operations in the Philippines, in order to sway the Philippine electorate. How do you see the state of our defenses when it comes to these sorts of operations, Professor? Are we ready to face down state actors if they're attempting to hijack Philippine democracy? And what role should the Philippine government be playing and could be playing in order to counteract these attempts to dissuade the Philippine population and destroy our morale?
Okay, wherever science advances, technology advances with it, and always there will be pluses and minuses. And since I'm basically, optimistic, guardedly optimistic, I like to see the pluses of AI. Once upon a time in the past, whenever I need to search for literature on something that I want to write on, I go to the library, go to the note cards, it smells like, and you know what they smell like, the library. And then it will take me like months to do that. Now, if I have the wherewithal, I ask the generative AI, look for all titles about regulating AI, or look for all titles about regional parliaments. And voila, I have them. I have a lay of the land, and I know, because I know the abstract titles, then I look at the abstracts and I proceed with my research. Look at all the efforts at cancer treatment, the efforts at autism, etc. I'm looking at all the pluses, what I can do for us. I'm looking at the correlates in health, for example. Why is it that, our young children are so stunted? And, when they go to school, they're hungry, etc. You use the AI as basis for policy making. That one I see. But I'm not blind to what the AI can do in it and its deleterious effects. Like if I'm running, and let's say on the eve of the election, my opponent tells, the voters that Carlos already died, and vote for me because she died, or you put me in I don't know about this thing, in an animation where I'm talking and I'm saying something else which I am not saying, to destroy me. I can see that bad aspect of the evil aspect of AI. But yes, in all, there's the plus, there is the minus, and that is to hope that there will be more pluses rather than minuses.
Is the Philippines ready to face the upcoming digital revolution that's currently unfolding, Professor? Are we ready to take on the both the pluses and the minuses? And what more can our government be doing in order to fully harness AI and harness digital technology in order to forward national security and human development?
Yes, this is one of our pluses. There are so many excellent AI young what among us, among the young people. And what we can do is really, as I said, first of all, clean up our databases. If you have compromised databases, like I'll give you an example, you can already count us, right? And yet, three agencies, the Statistics Office, Population Institute, the SWD, give us a different numbers. And they don't just differ in hundreds. They differ in millions. I said, oh my Lord, we are already alive. You cannot count us properly. Why is that a concern of mine? Not because I'm elderly, but because if you don't count us properly, what is the basis of your decision making? Jello data, data which is quivering, which is trembling. So clean up the database first before you talk about digitalizing. You might be digitalizing compromised data. And on the basis of that, share those data with other government agencies. How is it that every time I need to apply for something, I need to give an NBI clearance? For God's sake, why don't you share my NBI clearance with all the government agencies? Why do I need to do that all the time? These are all the pluses that, do you need an IQ 160 to do this? I don't think so.
And lastly, we have these constant reports of Philippine government websites and Philippine government databases, as you hinted, being hacked and being compromised either by state parties or by private individuals that would sell those data to the highest bidder in the dark web. Is it time that I've spoken also to other experts on this, and they talk about how the current regulatory and defense structure for our cybersecurity is too fragmented. It doesn't have fangs, especially like the DICT. Do you think it's time that we have a unified cyber command, for example, like what the Americans are doing, that would really regulate all of AI, all of cybersecurity in the country?
I'm glad that this would be the last issue area of our discussion, because I wrote the book on bureaucratic reform.
Yes.
All of this duplication, overlaps, and clear lines of authority, they have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed really sincerely in a comprehensive manner. And I hope some men of the president are listening, although I have discussed it with President Bongbong before when I was in cabinet. We need a major bureaucratic reform, and it is to be done by a presidential commission, not by the DBM.
All right, Professor Clarita Carlos, we're coming up to 1 hour. Thank you so much, Professor, for all your hard work and for coming on to Sitrep PH. Perhaps before we close, is there any last thing you wish to say to our listeners, especially as we move on to more, how can I put it, to more complicated periods in our geopolitical history? Any last thoughts and comments?
Maybe just a request, because some people have done this to me and I don't like it particularly. If you are going to share this with the public, share it in toto. Don't get snippets of this or that I mentioned without any context. That's my only request. And thank you. I enjoyed talking to you. I didn't know 1 hour had passed.
We had a very amazing discussion, and it would appear both of us had fun during it. Thank you so much, Professor. Where can people find you? Do you want to perhaps promote any of your social media pages, your upcoming works and conferences? If people want more of Clarita Carlos, where can people find her?
Now, usually I post. I'm in the Facebook because despite my age, I also want to be, part of the Facebook.
Course.
I usually post usually funny things that had happened to me, and I have some geopolitical quips there. But yes, and I'm teaching a course now here in the UP. I have my office at the Congress. Yeah. I'm sure you can find me because I'm all over the place.
It's good to see you back in the academe and doing what you especially love doing, Professor. Thank you so much. And this has been Sitrep PH, the podcast on Philippine affairs and Philippine interests. This has been Ivan at home, coming to you live from Manila. Make sure to follow our social media handles for further updates for our upcoming podcast and for access to our old episodes. We are at Sitrep PH on X and on YouTube, and like us on Facebook, facebook.com/Sitrep PH, one word. Philippines, thank you and good night. Mabuhay.